Most people fear isolation because they think being alone will destroy them. But some of the most dangerous transformations begin the moment a person is finally separated from constant noise, constant influence, and constant emotional access from other people. Isolation does not only remove company, it removes interference. And once the interference disappears, you begin seeing parts of yourself that were impossible to see while surrounded by everyone else. What makes this uncomfortable is that most people have spent their entire lives confusing connection with clarity. They assume constant interaction keeps them emotionally healthy, mentally balanced, socially aware. But if you observe carefully, many people are not thinking independently at all. Their emotions are shaped by the moods around them. Their opinions are shaped by repetition. Their identity is shaped by the expectations of whatever environment they remain trapped inside. And because of this, isolation feels threatening to them, because silence removes the distractions protecting them from themselves. Most people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of hearing themselves clearly without interruption. Machiavelli understood that separation changes perception. The moment you step away from constant social influence, something strange begins happening internally. You start noticing how much of your behavior was performative, how many reactions were automatic, how many conversations were unnecessary, how many versions of yourself only existed to maintain acceptance inside certain groups. Isolation exposes the difference between who you are and who you became, in order to remain psychologically comfortable around other people. This is why powerful transformation rarely begins in crowded environments. Real change usually starts in silence, in distance, in periods where external validation becomes unavailable and the mind is finally forced to confront itself directly. Most people avoid those moments for as long as possible because they mistake isolation for emptiness. But isolation is not empty. It is revealing. It removes the emotional fog created by constant social stimulation and forces you to see your life without distraction for the first time in years. The version of you that survives socially is not always the version of you that grows privately. And what you discover during that process is not always comforting. You begin realizing how many relationships were built around convenience instead of understanding, how often your personality shifted depending on who was present, how much energy was spent maintaining an image rather than developing inner stability. Isolation strips away social performance slowly, and many people become deeply uncomfortable the moment they no longer have an audience to reinforce who they believe they are. That discomfort is important because it reveals something most people never fully understand. A person who cannot tolerate being alone is usually controlled by environments more than they realize. Their emotional state depends on external input, external reassurance, external distraction, external approval, and once your internal stability becomes dependent on constant outside stimulation, your identity becomes fragile without you noticing it. This is why isolation often feels psychologically intense in the beginning. The mind suddenly loses the noise it was using to avoid unresolved thoughts, emotional exhaustion, suppressed resentment, or quiet dissatisfaction with life. Without constant conversation, entertainment, or social activity covering everything up, deeper truths begin surfacing naturally. And many people return to distraction immediately because clarity can feel more threatening than confusion at first. But the people who remain inside that silence long enough begin changing in ways others immediately notice. Their reactions slow down, their thinking becomes sharper, their emotional dependence weakens. They stop needing constant reassurance from other people before trusting their own perception. And perhaps most importantly, they begin separating real desires from socially conditioned ones. because isolation forces you to confront whether your life actually belongs to you or whether it was quietly constructed around external expectations from the beginning. Isolation becomes dangerous the moment you stop needing other people to confirm what you already see. Most people never reach that level of self-confrontation because modern life is designed to keep the mind constantly occupied. Noise everywhere, endless opinions, endless stimulation, endless emotional interruption. Human beings are rarely left alone long enough to think deeply anymore. And because of this, many people spend years surrounded by activity while remaining completely disconnected from themselves internally. They know how to respond socially, but they no longer know what they genuinely think when nobody else is present. Machiavelli observed that distance creates perspective. The farther you step away from constant influence, the more clearly you begin seeing the systems controlling people around you, their need for approval, their fear of exclusion, their emotional predictability, their dependence on attention. Isolation sharpens observation because once you stop participating in every social rhythm automatically, you finally have enough psychological distance to study human behavior instead of being unconsciously consumed by it. And this is where transformation quietly begins becoming power. Not loud power, not performative confidence, a calmer form of power, the kind that develops when your emotional state is no longer controlled by who accepts you, who ignores you, who praises you, or who misunderstands you. Most people never realize how much control others have over them emotionally until isolation temporarily removes those influences and exposes how dependent they had quietly become on constant social feedback. The less emotionally dependent you become, the more clearly human behavior reveals itself around you. You begin noticing something else during prolonged isolation. The people who panic most about being alone are often the same people who panic most about silence, stillness, or introspection. Because isolation removes external identity reinforcement. No audience, no social role to perform, no constant emotional exchange distracting the mind. Eventually, all that remains is your unfiltered relationship with yourself. And many people discover they have spent years avoiding that confrontation entirely. This is why powerful individuals throughout history repeatedly withdrew from people during periods of transformation. Not because they hated humanity, but because separation creates mental clarity that crowded environments destroy. The mind begins reorganizing itself differently when it is no longer constantly reacting to social pressure, emotional demands, and endless external noise. Isolation creates enough internal silence for deeper patterns to finally become visible. If this idea of isolation changing perception feels familiar to you, you should read my free ebook, The Art of Strategic Indifference. It explores emotional detachment, silence, psychological distance, and why stepping away from constant emotional access changes the way people see you and the way you see yourself. It is written for people beginning to understand human behavior beyond surface-level advice. The ebook is completely free. Link is in the description. You start seeing how easily groups influence perception, how quickly people adjust their beliefs to maintain belonging, how often individuals suppress honesty simply to avoid social friction. Once you step outside those dynamics for long enough, human behavior begins looking very different, less rational, more emotionally driven, more predictable. And that awareness changes the way you move through the world because you stop confusing collective agreement with truth. Most people never notice how much of their personality exists to maintain belonging. At first, people around you may interpret your isolation incorrectly. They may assume sadness, weakness, failure, or emotional instability, because most people only understand solitude through the lens of loneliness. But there is a major difference between isolation and loneliness. Loneliness is craving connection you cannot reach. Isolation is intentionally reducing interference so you can hear your own mind clearly again. And psychologically, those are completely different states. The dangerous thing about constant social exposure is that it slowly fragments attention. Your thoughts become interrupted before they fully develop. Your emotions become shaped by endless reactions. Your identity becomes scattered across different environments, different expectations, different performances. Over time, many people lose the ability to sit still long enough to understand what they genuinely feel because their nervous system becomes addicted to constant external movement. Isolation interrupts that cycle. It forces attention inward again. And once that happens, hidden truths begin surfacing almost immediately. You begin questioning routines that once felt normal, relationships that once felt necessary, goals that once felt important. Because many ambitions are not born from genuine desire at all. They are inherited socially through comparison, pressure, imitation, and unconscious competition with the people surrounding you. Some desires disappear completely the moment nobody else is around to reinforce them. This is one of the reasons transformation becomes so difficult inside highly social environments. Every major internal change threatens the expectations people have attached to you. The moment you become quieter, more distant, more reflective, or less emotionally available, others often become uncomfortable. Not always because you change negatively, but because your transformation interrupts the version of you they had psychologically grown familiar with. And this is where many people unconsciously sabotage themselves. They return to noise too early. They reconnect before clarity fully develops. They seek reassurance before their own perception becomes stable enough to stand independently. But transformation requires enough separation for old emotional patterns to weaken before new ones can fully form. Without that separation, people often rebuild the exact same identity they were trying to escape in the first place. Machiavelli understood that people reveal themselves differently once you become less emotionally accessible. Distance changes behavior. Some individuals become more respectful, others become irritated. Some lose interest entirely once constant access disappears. Isolation gives you something extremely valuable psychologically. It exposes which relationships depended on genuine understanding and which ones depended mostly on convenience, attention, or emotional availability. You also begin discovering how much unnecessary emotional weight disappears once constant interaction decreases. Fewer explanations, fewer performances, fewer invisible pressures to respond, reassure, impress, entertain, or emotionally manage the expectations of everyone around you. The mind becomes quieter when it is no longer overloaded by endless social maintenance. And inside that quietness, perception becomes far more precise. The quieter your environment becomes, the easier it is to recognize what was quietly draining you the entire time. That precision changes the way you see people permanently. You begin recognizing patterns faster. Manipulation becomes easier to detect. Emotional dependency becomes more visible. Forced social dynamics begin feeling obvious instead of normal. And once perception sharpens to that level, returning to unconscious living becomes almost impossible, because awareness changes your tolerance for artificial behavior permanently. This is why isolation often produces emotional detachment as a side effect, not coldness, not lack of feeling. Detachment in the sense that you stop reacting automatically to every opinion, every criticism, every emotional shift happening around you. The distance teaches your nervous system that not every external stimulus deserves immediate emotional involvement. And that alone creates a level of psychological stability many people never experience in their entire lives. Comment isolation if you have ever noticed that distance changed the way you saw people permanently. Most people assume confidence comes from social success, attention, validation, approval. But some of the deepest forms of confidence are actually built in isolation, when nobody is reinforcing your value externally, and you are forced to develop internal certainty instead. That kind of confidence moves differently. It speaks less, reacts less, needs less reassurance, because it was developed without constant emotional dependence on the approval of other people. Confidence built in isolation feels different because nobody handed it to you psychologically. And perhaps that is why isolation feels so threatening to society itself. A person who becomes comfortable alone is far more difficult to influence, harder to manipulate through approval, harder to pressure through exclusion, harder to emotionally control through public perception. Once someone develops stability without constant external reinforcement, many traditional methods of social influence begin losing their power over them completely. But this does not mean permanent isolation is the goal. That is where many people misunderstand the process. Isolation is not meant to disconnect you from humanity forever. It is meant to separate you long enough to rebuild clarity before re-entering the world differently, stronger internally, more aware, less emotionally dependent, more selective with attention, energy, and access. The purpose of isolation is not escape, it is reconstruction. And once that reconstruction begins, even your presence changes. You stop speaking just to fill silence. You stop chasing emotional reassurance. You stop needing every person to understand you completely. There is a calmness that develops when your identity no longer depends on constant external confirmation. Other people notice it immediately, even if they cannot fully explain why. Because internally, stable people move through social environments differently than emotionally dependent ones do. People sense internal stability long before they understand where it came from. You become more difficult to pressure emotionally because your nervous system is no longer starving for approval or constant connection. Silence stops feeling threatening. Solitude stops feeling empty. Distance stops feeling painful. Instead, those things begin feeling protective, necessary even. And once a person reaches that stage psychologically, they stop making many of the desperate decisions that emotionally dependent people make under pressure. This is why some of the most transformative periods of your life may initially feel like loss. Fewer people around you, less noise, less stimulation, less emotional chaos. But underneath that apparent emptiness, something deeper is happening quietly. Your mind is recovering its ability to think without constant interference. Your emotions are stabilizing without endless external influence. Your identity is rebuilding itself from the inside instead of being shaped continuously from the outside. And in that process, you begin understanding something most people never fully realize. Isolation was never punishing you. It was separating you from environments, influences, and patterns that prevented you from hearing your own mind clearly. Some transformations only become possible once the noise disappears long enough for you to finally recognize who you are without everyone else speaking over you. Isolation often removes more confusion than comfort. Machiavelli understood that people who spend too much time surrounded by others eventually begin losing the ability to distinguish their own instincts from collective influence. They react when everyone reacts, desire what everyone desires, fear what everyone fears. But isolation interrupts that unconscious synchronization. It forces independent thought to return, and independent thought is dangerous. Because once a person begins seeing clearly for themselves, they become far less controllable by the emotional currents moving everyone else. The longer you remain capable of sitting alone with your own thoughts, without immediately escaping into distraction, the stronger your perception becomes. You start hearing subtleties other people miss. You begin noticing emotional manipulation faster. You become less reactive, less impulsive, less desperate for immediate validation, because the mind becomes sharper when it is no longer constantly overcrowded by the emotional noise of other people. And eventually, isolation stops feeling like separation entirely. It begins feeling like ownership. Ownership over your attention, your emotional state, your identity, your perception, your peace. Most people spend their entire lives psychologically entangled with environments that continuously shape the way they think and feel without them realizing it. But once you experience what clarity feels like without constant interference, returning to unconscious dependence becomes almost unbearable. Once your mind experiences clarity without constant interference, noise begins feeling heavier than silence. This is why the strongest transformations rarely announce themselves loudly in the beginning. They often start quietly. One person withdrawing from noise, one person spending more time observing than reacting, one person becoming less emotionally available to environments that once consumed all of their attention. And while the outside world may interpret that distance as weakness, confusion, or withdrawal, internally something far more dangerous is happening. The person is rebuilding themselves beyond the reach of constant external control. Most people will never understand this process because they only judge transformation by visible results: more status, more confidence, more recognition. But the deepest transformations happen long before any external evidence appears. They begin internally, in silence, when a person finally stops allowing every outside voice to shape the direction of their mind. That is why isolation feels uncomfortable at first, not because it weakens you, but because it removes everything you were unconsciously using to avoid confronting yourself directly. And once you survive that confrontation, something irreversible begins happening psychologically. You stop fearing silence. You stop fearing distance. You stop fearing the loss of constant approval, because you realize most of the control other people had over you only existed through your dependence on their attention, validation, and emotional presence. Isolation breaks that dependence slowly, and what remains afterward is often the strongest version of a person that has ever existed beneath the noise. Some people disappear from the world temporarily because they are rebuilding themselves beyond recognition. If this video made you understand isolation differently, download my free ebook, The Art of Strategic Indifference, through the link in the description. It goes deeper into silence, emotional control, psychological distance, social power, manipulation patterns, and the hidden dynamics that only become visible once you separate yourself from constant noise and emotional dependence. And let me ask you something. What changed inside you the most during periods where you were completely alone? Let me know in the comments. If you know someone currently going through isolation, share this video with them. Subscribe if you want more psychological observations like this. And if you want access to the private material I do not fully structure for public platforms, there is also a Patreon linked in the description where I share deeper observations on power, restraint, human behavior, emotional control, perception, and psychological strategy, with the viewers who understand these subjects beyond surface level.